June 22nd, 1941. The dusty plains outside Minsk, Soviet Union. The rumble of T-34 tanks echoed like thunder across the flat, endless fields, their diesel engines growling as they pushed forward through the knee-high grass. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Dietrich gripped the edge of his half-track's windshield, the wind whipping at his face, carrying the sharp tang of cordite and churned earth. His Panzer Division, the 18th, had been rolling east for weeks now, a steel spearhead slicing through the Red Army's defenses. Operation Barbarossa was in full swing, and this stretch of the front felt like a dream. Too easy, almost. From his vantage point, Dietrich scanned the horizon through binoculars. Smoke rose in lazy columns from burning Soviet positions a few kilometers back, where his panzers had shattered a disorganized counterattack just yesterday. The Ivan's T-26 tanks were relics, outmatched by the sleek lines of his Panzer IIIs and IVs, armed with 50 mm and 75 mm guns that punched through armor like paper. Intelligence reports had been spot on. The Soviets were reeling, their lines fragmented, supplies stretched thin after Stalin's purges gutted the officer corps. "They're breaking, Herr Oberstleutnant," shouted Sergeant Klaus Werner from the driver's seat, his voice barely cutting through the roar. Werner, a wiry Berliner with a perpetual squint, nodded toward a cluster of abandoned ISU-152 prototypes, massive, lumbering assault guns the Reds had rushed into production but couldn't crew properly. Dietrich allowed himself a grim smile. Victory seemed inevitable here on the Central Front. Minsk was within grasp, and with it a gateway to Moscow. His division's objective was clear: secure the Dnieper River crossings before the Soviets could regroup. But as the half-track jolted over a rutted farm track, a faint crackle interrupted the din. The radio operator in the back, Private Müller, twisting dials on the FUG-5 set. Static hissed, then a voice broke through. "Eagle 1 to all units. Recon reports enemy armor massing 5 clicks northeast. Estimate 20 KV-1 heavies supported by infantry. Proceed with caution." Dietrich's jaw tightened. KV-1s? Those behemoths were nightmares. Thick-skinned monsters with 76mm guns that could brew up a Panzer IV from over a kilometer away. But 20. Exaggerated, probably. His own artillery spotters had the 105mm howitzers zeroed in, and Luftwaffe Stukas were en route, their Jericho sirens ready to sow terror from the skies. He keyed his throat mic. "All panzer commanders, this is Iron Fist. Flank left, form wedge. Gunners, load heat rounds, we'll smash them before lunch." The column responded with disciplined efficiency. Engines revved higher. Tracks clanking as the panzers fanned out, their commanders' cupolas swiveling like watchful eyes. You can almost feel it, the vibration thrumming through your bones, the acrid bite of exhaust in your throat, the way the summer sun glints off riveted steel. Dietrich's mind raced through the playbook, faint with the lighter Panzer IIIs. Let the IVs punch the heavies, then mop up with infantry and Saar. KFZ, 251 half-tracks. Casualties would be light. The Reds fought with desperation, but without coordination. As they crested a low rise, the battlefield unfolded like a diorama of chaos. Soviet positions dotted the plain, trenches hastily dug, anti-tank guns like the 45mm Model 1937 half buried in the dirt, but no massed armor yet. Dietrich's radio man relayed updates. The Luftwaffe was delayed by weather over Warsaw, but ground support was solid. A battery of Nebelwerfers, those screaming rocket launchers, unleashed a salvo, the whoosh and crump sending dirt fountains skyward, scattering Soviet scouts like startled rabbits. Then the first shots. A KV-1 lumbered into view from a tree line, its long barrel traversing slowly. Boom! The shell whistled past Dietrich's half-track, gouging a crater that showered them with soil. "Contact!" he barked. His lead Panzer III fired back, the 50mm round sparking off the KV's sloped frontal armor. No penetration. The Soviet tank returned fire, and this time the round struck true. A secondary explosion as the Panzer's ammo rack cooked off, flames licking the turret. Panic flickered in Dietrich's chest, but he quashed it. "Flank it! Call in the 88s!" The flak 80T T-nanometer guns, dual-purpose wonders mounted on half-tracks, were their aces, anti-aircraft beasts that shredded tanks at range. Orders flew over the radio net, crisp and urgent. Infantry dismounted, MG-34 machine guns chattering from the half-tracks, pinning down Soviet riflemen in their foxholes. The air filled with the staccato of small arms, the deeper cough of tank cannons, and the distant wail of incoming artillery. For a moment, it teetered on the edge. Dietrich's panzers circled, probing for weak spots. One KV-1 bogged down in a ditch, its crew bailing out under a hail of MP-40 fire from his Schützen. Another took a direct hit from a pursuing Panzer V's 75mm, the turret ring shearing off in a gout of fire. The Soviets were tough, but uncoordinated, officers shouting contradictory orders, radios silent. Victory hung there, tangible, like the sweat beading on your brow under the relentless sun. But then, the radio crackled again. "Iron Fist, this is command. Urgent. Stand down. Advance. New intel. Major Soviet counteroffensive inbound from the north. Regroup at waypoint Bravo." Dietrich froze. Stand down. They had the momentum, the enemy on the ropes. His gunners were reloading, the remaining KVs retreating hull down behind a ridge. What counteroffensive? The reports from earlier recon had been clear, no such build-up. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the mic. 10 minutes. That's all it would take to finish this. To claim the field and press on. The wind picked up, carrying the moans of the wounded and the fading echoes of battle. In those fleeting seconds, the weight of command settled like lead on his shoulders. Push forward or pull back? The choice seemed simple, but in war, simplicity was the first casualty. If you want to dive deeper into stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Dietrich's half-track shuddered to a halt on the ridge, the engine idling with a low growl that mirrored the turmoil in his gut. The radio's urgent plea hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Stand down, regroup. But the battlefield below told a different story. The remaining KV-1s were withdrawing, their massive tracks churning mud as they lumbered back toward the tree line. Trailing black exhaust. His panzers had the upper hand. Two more Soviet heavies smoldered in the grass, crews scrambling out only to be cut down by precise bursts from the MG-34s. The infantry was advancing, Zadenkirchner 251s rumbling forward with their mounted 20-meter autocannons spitting lead. He glanced at Werner, whose hands hovered over the controls, eyes wide with that mix of eagerness and fear that defined every man in the division. "Herr Oberstleutnant?" Werner prompted, voice steady but laced with the unspoken question. "Push on or obey?" Dietrich's mind flashed to the maps in his command tent back at the staging area, carefully plotted lines showing the Dnieper crossings just beyond this plain. Minsk's fall would unhinge the entire Soviet Western Front, and his division was the tip of the blade. The new intel? Vague, unverified. Recon flights had spotted nothing substantial from the north an hour ago. 10 minutes. That's all he needed to shatter this pocket and secure the high ground. Delay now and the Reds might slip away. Regroup with fresh units from the reserves Stalin was pulling from the Urals. Disregard the stand down, Dietrich said finally, his voice cutting through the static like a knife. All units, advance at best speed. Secure the ridge in 10 minutes. Iron Fist out. He switched off the mic before doubt could creep back in. Orders from command were sacred, but in the fog of war, they were often echoes of outdated reports. His men needed momentum, not hesitation. The column surged forward again, panzers kicking up dust devils as they descended the slope. You can hear it, the crescendo of engines, the metallic clank of gears shifting, the urgent chatter over the radio net as platoon leaders confirmed the push. Sergeant Werner floored it, the half-track bouncing over shell craters, jolting Private Miller against his radio gear. "They're with us, sir," Miller reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the open air. No pushback from command yet. The advance was electric. A Panzer IV, commanded by Captain Erich von Stahl, a Prussian noble with a scar across his cheek from Poland, led the wedge. His tanks, 75mm KWK-37, barked, slamming around into the retreating KV-1's rear armor. The beast erupted in flames, the turret hatch flying open as the crew bailed, only to meet a storm of fire from the following infantry. Von Stahl's voice crackled over the net. "First blood, Iron Fist. Flanking left, watch for AT guns." Dietrich nodded to himself, the wind tearing at his field cap. This was war at its rawest. The thrill of the hunt, the Soviets' desperation cracking under pressure. His spotters had the Nebelwerfers reloaded. Another salvo rocketed out, the eerie whistle followed by explosions that blanketed the tree line in fire and shrapnel. Soviet riflemen broke from cover, hands raised, only to be herded by his Schutzen, with bayonets fixed on their carabiner 98Ks. Casualties were mounting on their side, a half-track brewed up by a hidden 76mm ZIS-3, its gunner screaming as flames consumed the vehicle. But the tide was turning. 5 minutes in, and they owned the field. The ridge crest was theirs, a commanding vantage overlooking the Dnieper's distant shimmer. Dietrich dismounted, boots sinking into the soft earth still warm from impacts. He lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the breeze, and surveyed the gains. Abandoned Soviet gear littered the ground, PPSH-41 submachine guns, discarded Mosin Nagants, crates of 152mm shells for those cursed ISU prototypes. His engineers were already probing for mines, while medics triaged the wounded under the shadow of a Panzer III's hull. "Recon clear, sir," Müller said, clipping a fresh battery into the Fu G5. "No enemy armor in sight. We've bagged 8 KVs confirmed." Dietrich exhaled smoke, allowing a flicker of triumph. Command would understand. Results spoke louder than protocols. He keyed the mic to report the success, but before the words formed, the northern horizon shifted. At first it was subtle, a low rumble, deeper than thunder, vibrating through the ground like an earthquake's precursor. Then dust clouds bloomed vast and ominous, as if the earth itself were rising. "Contact north!" Von Stahl's voice exploded over the radio, laced with alarm. "Multiple heavies! Jesus, that's no 20! That's a division! T-34s, KV-2s, the works!" Dietrich's cigarette fell from his lips, crushed underfoot. Through his binoculars, the nightmare unfolded. A Soviet armored spearhead, at least 50 tanks strong, erupting from concealed positions in the birchwoods. Zhukov's reserves, whipped into shape despite the purges, rolling south with infantry riding on the hulls, their red stars glinting in the sun. Leading them were KV-2s, those hulking fortresses with 152mm howitzers that could level a house at 1,000 meters. Flanking them, swarms of T-34s, their sloped armor shrugging off early potshots from his outgunned Panzer IIIs. Panic rippled through the line. "Fall back to the ridge!" Dietrich bellowed, but it was too late for grace. His panzers traversed turrets, firing on the move. But the Soviets had the numbers and the element of surprise. A T-34's 76mm round struck von Stahl's IV dead on, the frontal plate crumpling as the tank slewed to a halt. Secondary explosions lighting the plane. Screams cut the air, crewmen clawing from the escape hatch, only to be silenced by machine gun fire. The Nebelwerfers fired blindly, rockets arcing into the dust cloud. But the Soviet advance didn't falter. Infantry dismounted in waves, supported by Katyusha launchers that turned the sky into a howling inferno. Dietrich remounted his half-track, heart pounding as shells whistled overhead. "All units disengage, regroup at Bravo, now." But the 10 minutes had cost them. Flanks exposed, ammo half spent, the ridge no longer a stronghold but a kill zone. Werner gunned the engine. the half-track lurching backward as a KV-2's massive shell cratered the ground mere meters away, showering them with dirt and debris. Muller clutched the radio, babbling coordinates amid the chaos. The victory that had tasted so sweet moments ago soured into dread. Command's warning hadn't been a mistake, it had been prophecy. And in those fateful 10 minutes, Dietrich's gamble had invited disaster, turning a certain triumph into a rout that echoed across the front. As the half-track retreated, the Soviet guns thundered closer, their barrage painting the sky in fire. How many would make it back? The question hung heavier than the smoke, pulling the division into the abyss. The flames of retreat. The half-track's engine screamed in protest as Werner threw it into reverse, tires spinning in the mud before catching traction. Shells from the Soviet barrage rained down like apocalyptic hail, each impact sending geysers of earth skyward, close enough to rattle Dietrich's teeth. He clutched the radio handset, shouting orders into the chaos. "Iron fist to all units, pull back, cover each other, form a rearguard with the IVs." But the net was a cacophony of desperate voices. Platoon leaders calling out hits, gunners pleading for ammo resupply that wouldn't come. The ridge, their hard-won prize just minutes ago, was now a graveyard of twisted metal and broken men. You feel it in your gut, that sick lurch, as the world tilts from hunter to hunted. Dietrich's division, the vaunted 18th Panzer, scattered like leaves in a storm. Captain von Stahl's Panzer IV was gone, a flaming hulk belching black smoke, its crew's fate sealed in the inferno. Other tanks fared little better. A Panzer III slewed sideways, its track blown off by a T-34's flanking shot, the commander waving futilely from the turret before a burst from a Soviet DP-28 light machine gun stitched the air around him. Infantry in the Stieg KFZ-251s dismounted under fire, hauling wounded comrades while MG-34s barked defiance, their 7.92mm rounds zipping toward the advancing Reds like angry hornets. The Soviet counteroffensive was a juggernaut, Zhukov's handiwork evident in its ruthless precision. Dozens of T-34s surged forward, their 76mm F-34 guns belching fire in coordinated volleys, sloped armor deflecting the desperate counterfire from Dietrich's lighter panzers. KV-2s anchored the line, those dreadnoughts with their massive 152mm M10 howitzers, lobbing shells that cratered the earth 50 meters wide, turning half-tracks into scrap. Katyusha rockets streaked overhead in multiples of 48, the Stalin's organs wailing like banshees before detonating in curtains of shrapnel that shredded anything exposed. Soviet infantry, tough Siberians in greatcoats, armed with SVT-40 rifles and PPSH-41 Papashas, swarmed the flanks, using the smoke for cover, their officers barking commands in guttural Russian that carried over the din. Dietrich's mind reeled, piecing together the disaster in flashes. Those 10 minutes, his arrogant push, had left the flanks hanging, no time to consolidate or call in the 88mm flak batteries properly positioned back at the staging area. Recon had missed this, or worse, the intel from command had been spot on, and he'd dismissed it as fog of war noise. Now his engineers were blowing charges on abandoned gear to deny it to the enemy, while medics dragged the burned and bleeding into makeshift aid stations under the hulls of surviving panzers. Private Müller, face smeared with grime, twisted the few G5's dials frantically. "Sir, command's screaming for a sitrep. They're vectoring Ju-87 Stukas, but cloud cover's thick, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes, an eternity in this hell. Werner swerved to avoid a downed T-34 that had somehow penetrated the line, its turret askew, a German MP-40 lying beside a dead Soviet crewman. The half-track jolted over the body, the thump echoing in Dietrich's ears like an accusation. Losses mounted, reports trickled in of 8 panzers knocked out. A dozen half-tracks afire, infantry platoons cut off and fighting hand-to-hand with entrenching tools and bare fists. Sergeant Klaus Werner glanced back. his squint now a grimace. "We can't outrun them, Herr Oberstleutnant. The mud slowing the heavies, but those T-34s are built for this ground." Dietrich nodded grimly, scanning the rearview mirror. The Soviet tide was relentless, but cracks showed, their advance bunched in the dust, vulnerable to a counterpunch if he could muster one. "Signal the rear guard. Von Luck's company. Hold the tree line with the Nebelwerfers. Buy us time." Major Hans von Luck, a steady hand from the reconnaissance battalion, acknowledged instantly, his voice calm amid the storm. Rockets whooshed out from the multiple launchers, the screaming barrage forcing the lead T-34s to button up and veer, buying precious seconds. The retreat coalesced into a fighting withdrawal, panzers leapfrogging in pairs, one firing while the other repositioned, their 75mm rounds occasionally brewing up a Soviet tank in payback. Dietrich's own half-track led a cluster of survivors toward waypoint Bravo, a forested defile 10 kilometers west, where the division's supply echelon waited with fuel and reserves. The air stank of burning oil and cordite, the sun dipping low to cast long shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Friend or foe in the haze? Wounded men moaned from the back, one private clutching a gut wound, his uniform soaked crimson. "It was a trap, sir," he gasped. "They were waiting all along." Dietrich didn't respond, his thoughts a whirlwind of recrimination. The purges had left the Red Army leaderless, or so the briefing said. Yet here was proof of their resilience, Stalin's meat grinder forging fanatics from the chaos. His gamble had exposed the Central Front's fragility. If Minsk fell now, it wouldn't be to his spearhead but to this armored avalanche. Radio traffic from higher command crackled in. 18th Panzer, this is Army Group Center. Confirm position, Luftwaffe inbound. Do not engage further. Consolidate or we lose the pocket. Consolidate. The word tasted like ash. As they crested a shallow rise, the defile came into view, a ribbon of birch trees offering scant cover. But the Soviets pressed, a KV-2's earth-shaking boom, sending a shell that obliterated a trailing Panzer III, the shockwave buffeting the half-track like a giant slap. Müller yelped as shrapnel pinged off the armor. "They're gaining, sir! 500 meters and closing!" Dietrich keyed the mic one last time, voice hoarse. "Iron Fist to command, regrouping Bravo, losses heavy, request immediate air support." He switched off, staring at the onrushing dust cloud. The Stukas might arrive in time to stem the bleed, their 37mm cannons and bombs turning the tide as they had at Sedan. But doubt gnawed. Had his error rippled outward, drawing reserves that could blunt the entire Barbarossa thrust? The half-track plunged into the trees, branches whipping like vengeful spirits. The roar of pursuit fading but not silenced. In the dimming light as the column coalesced around fuel trucks and hasty defenses, Dietrich stepped out, boots crunching on fallen leaves. Medics worked by lantern light, the moans of the dying a grim chorus. Von Luck reported in, his face etched with fatigue. "Rearguard held, but we left 20 vehicles burning. The Reds own the ridge now." Dietrich nodded, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. Victory had slipped through his fingers in those 10 minutes, and the cost was just beginning to tally. But as the first Stuka engines droned overhead, piercing the night, a new resolve hardened. Regroup, reinforce, turn this route into a stand. Yet in the shadows whispers spread among the men. Was the Oberstleutnant's hubris, the spark that could ignite broader flames? The front teetered, and the night held its breath for what dawn would bring. Dawn's bitter reckoning. The first hints of dawn filtered through the birch canopy, turning the defile at waypoint Bravo into a mosaic of grey shadows and flickering lantern light. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Dietrich paced the muddy ground beside his half-track, the chill air nipping at his exposed neck despite the heavy wool greatcoat. Exhaustion clawed at him, eyes burning from the night's vigil, the acrid stench of cordite and diesel clinging to his uniform like a second skin. Around him, the remnants of the 18th Panzer Division huddled in defensive clusters. Surviving Panzer IVs dug in with hulls low to the earth, their 75mm guns trained northward. Sandekev Z-251 half-tracks forming a hasty perimeter, their 20mm flak auto cannons swiveling watchfully. Engineers worked feverishly, welding spare plates onto vulnerable spots, while quartermasters distributed the last crates of 88mm shells from the supply echelon. Sergeant Klaus Werner slumped against a tire, nursing a bandaged arm from shrapnel, his squint deeper than ever in the half-light. Private Miller fiddled with the FUG-5 radio, static hissing like a serpent as he scanned for Luftwaffe frequencies. The night's retreat had cost them dearly, 22 panzers and half-tracks lost, over 100 men dead or wounded, the ridge abandoned to the Soviets like a discarded trophy. Whispers circulated among the Schützen. The Oberstleutnant's push had been folly, command's warning ignored in a blaze of overconfidence. Dietrich felt their eyes on him, heavy with unspoken blame, but he pushed it down. Survival first, recriminations later. A low drone pierced the quiet, the unmistakable wail of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka engines, diving like avenging angels from the east. Dietrich's head snapped up, relief flooding his veins like cool water. "They're here," he muttered, keying the mic. "Iron fist to Luftwaffe control. Targets in the open, coordinates Bravo 7. Hit them hard." The response crackled back affirmative. Laced with the clipped efficiency of Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Fliegerkorps, the Stuka's parent unit under Army Group Center. You hear it building. The scream of the Jericho sirens as the first trio of Stukas peeled into their signature dive. Black crosses stark against the paling sky. Bombs whistled earthward, 500 kilos SC-250s detonating in thunderous roars that shook the defile, sending plumes of fire and debris skyward. The Soviet spearhead, emboldened by the night's gains, had pressed to within 3 kilometers, their T-34s and KV-2s strung out in pursuit columns along the rutted track. Now those columns erupted in chaos. A lead KV-2 took a direct hit, its massive turret shearing off in a fireball, the 152mm howitzer flying like a discarded toy. T-34s scattered, commanders buttoning up hatches as machine guns chattered blindly, their sloped armor no shield against the Stuka's precision. Wave after wave followed, 12 Stukas in all, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109s that strafed Soviet infantry with 20mm MGFF cannons, turning clusters of Siberians into ragged heaps amid the birch stumps. Dietrich watched through binoculars, the acrid bite of high-octane fuel mixing with the dawn mist. One bomber pulled out low, its 37mm BK-3, 7 guns barking anti-tank rounds that punched through a T-34's side, brewing it up in seconds. Soviet Katyushas tried to reply, rockets arcing wildly into the clouds, but the Flak 88s from the division's rear echelon answered, their high-velocity shells stitching the sky and downing a launcher truck in a spectacular explosion. For a fleeting hour, the tide reversed. Von Luck's rearguard, reinforced by fresh infantry from the reserves, pushed out under the air umbrella, Karabiner 98Ks cracking as they reclaimed a forward outpost. A Panzer IV, commanded by the grizzled Lieutenant Fritz Bauer, rolled into the fray, its KWK-40, the early L-43 variant, slamming AP rounds into the Soviet flank. 2 T-34s fell, their crews bailing into the underbrush only to meet PPSH-41 fire from hidden Soviet positions. Cheers rippled through the line, ragged but real, as medics hauled the worst wounded to the aid station, morphine syrettes and sulfur powder their only mercy. Dietrich allowed himself a nod to Werner. "Told you the birds would turn it." But the elation was brittle. Reports from scouts painted a grim picture. The Soviet counteroffensive wasn't isolated. Zhukov had committed elements of the 13th Mechanized Corps, over 400 tanks strong. Funneled through gaps, his delay had widened. Minsk's defenses, meant to buckle under the initial blitz, now braced for a mauling counterpunch. Command's voice broke through the radio static. 18th Panzer, this is OKH, forward. Cease offensive ops. Dietrich, report to Divisional HQ immediately. Luftwaffe cover holds for now. Hold the line. The summons hit like a gut punch. HQ, Oberkommando des Heeres Liaison, probably with Guderian's staff breathing down their necks. His 10-minute error had snowballed. The ridge loss exposed the central axis, forcing Army Group Center to divert panzer reserves from the southern thrust, delaying the drive on Kiev. Casualties tallied higher with each sitrep. Sergeant Werner's wound was minor, others weren't. A young Gefreiter from the signals platoon lay nearby, his face pale under the bandages, whispering of home in Hamburg as the surgeon probed for the bullet fragment. As the Stukas climbed away, their engines fading into the morning haze, the Soviet guns opened up again. Distant at first, then probing, 76 Mutti Zi-S-3s from towed batteries lobbing shells that cratered the defile's edge. Infantry probed the perimeter, shadows darting through the trees, SVT-40 rifles spitting fire. Von Luck's men repelled the first assault. Grenades arcing into the brush, but ammo dwindled. Dietrich mounted his half-track, Müller relaying the order to consolidate. "Sir, they're not pushing hard yet," Müller said, voice tight. "Regrouping, like us." The drive to HQ was a blur. 10 kilometers of scarred earth, past burned-out wrecks that marked their flight. Werner drove one-handed, the half-track jolting over ruts, the wind carrying faint echoes of battle. Dietrich's mind churned, explanations, justifications. The intel had seemed solid, the momentum irresistible. But hubris? No, calculated risk. Yet doubt festered. What if his stand-down defiance had cracked the front wide, inviting Stalin's hordes to pour through? Divisional HQ squatted in a bombed-out farmhouse south of the Dnieper. Canvas tents flapping beside staff cars and a signals truck bristling with antennas. General Heinz Guderian himself wasn't there, tied up with higher command, but his chief of staff, Colonel Kurt Zeitzler, waited, maps spread on a folding table under the harsh glow of a petrol lantern. Zeitzler's face was a mask of controlled fury, eyes like flints behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Oberstleutnant Dietrich," he said without preamble, gesturing to a chair. "Your report, and make it good. The Reichsmarshal's already howling about Luftwaffe assets wasted on your mess." Dietrich stood rigid, recounting the engagement, the initial contact, the disregarded order, the advance's gains, the ambush's devastation. Zeitzler interrupted with pointed questions. Why ignore the stand-down? Where were the flank screens? The answers rang hollow, even to him. Maps showed the ripple. Soviet reserves redirected, the 4th Panzer Group now stalled. Minsk's encirclement in jeopardy. You've turned a breakthrough into a bloodbath, Zeitzler concluded, tapping a pencil on the table. Casualties. 18% of your division gone in hours. Army Group Center's momentum, blunted. Explain how 10 minutes justifies that. Silence stretched, broken only by the distant crump of artillery. Dietrich met the colonel's gaze. "It was a gamble for the objective, Herr Oberst. The Reds were breaking, we had them." But Zeitzler shook his head. "Gambles win wars or lose them. Yours lost ground. Demotion pending inquiry. Now get back, hold Bravo, or we lose more than a ridge." The half-track roared back toward the defile as noon sun burned away the mist, revealing fresh Soviet movements. More T-34s massing, infantry digging in. Radio chatter surged, von Luck under pressure, Nebelwerfers low on rockets. Dietrich gripped the edge, the weight of command heavier than ever. The Stukas had bought time, but the error's shadow loomed larger, threatening to engulf the entire front. As shells began to fall again, closer now, he wondered if redemption was possible, or if those 10 minutes had sealed fates far beyond his division's shattered ranks. The battle for Minsk hung by a thread, and the pull of the abyss grew stronger. Shattered spearhead. The sun climbed higher over the scarred plains, baking the mud into cracked clay that sucked at the treads of the surviving Panzer I-4s hunkered in the defile. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Dietrich's half-track ground to a halt amid the defensive line, dust settling like a shroud over the weary men of the 18th Panzer Division. Shells from Soviet 76mm ZIS-3 batteries whistled overhead sporadically, probing the perimeter without committing to assault, as if the Reds savoured the Germans' exhaustion. Dietrich dismounted, his boots squelching in the mire, and surveyed the toll. Fuel drums lashed to half-tracks for hasty refills, medics stitching wounds under canvas tarps, the low moan of a diesel generator powering field radios that crackled with grim updates from the front. Major Hans von Luck approached, his reconnaissance Abteilung Sendi Kfz 222 armoured cars parked in a tight lager, their 20mm cannons still hot from repelling the morning probes. Von Luck's face was gaunt, streaked with camouflage grease, but his voice held steady. "They're digging in on the ridge, sir. T-34s in hull-down positions, infantry entrenching with those damned PM-41 76mm guns. No full push yet. Zhukov's consolidating, waiting for night or air cover to lift." Dietrich nodded, lighting a cigarette with a Zippo that flickered in the breeze, carrying the faint rot of unburied dead from the night before. The Stuka's intervention had clawed back a sliver of ground, downing a dozen Soviet tanks and scattering their infantry, but it was a bandage on a severed artery. Reports from divisional signals painted the broader canvas. The 4th Panzer Group, Heinz Guderian's pride, bogged down as Soviet reserves, elements of the 20th Mechanized Corps, poured south through the gap his delay had pried open. Minsk, that glittering prize just 30 kilometers east, now bristled with fresh Red Army divisions. Stalin's purges be damned. The survivors had learned fast, turning desperation into doctrine. Private Müller waved from the radio tent, his FUG-5 set humming with intercepted chatter. "Herr Oberstleutnant, Army Group Center on the line. Urgent, pull back to secondary line at the Berezina." The pockets collapsing. Dietrich's stomach knotted. The Berezina, Napoleon's graveyard from 1812, now their fallback. It meant abandoning the Dnieper crossings entirely, ceding initiative to the Soviets in a sector where Barbarossa's blitz was meant to shatter them. He snatched the handset, Colonel Zeitzler's voice crackling through like gravel. "Dietrich, your stunts cost us the central thrust. Guderian's furious, diverted 2 panzer regiments to plug your hole. Report confirmed. Soviet 13th Corps has encircled a forward battalion. Extract or we're writing off 500 men." The words landed like blows. Encircled. Dietrich's mind flashed to the men left behind, Schützen from his infantry companies, cut off in the birchwoods during the retreat. Their MG-34 nests now silent under Soviet PPSH-41 fire. He could picture it. Desperate radio pleas fading to static, T-34s circling like wolves, crews bailing into the underbrush only to face bayonets and grenades. "Understood, Herr Oberst," he replied, voice leaden. "Initiating withdrawal. Iron fist out." He switched off, the click echoing his fracture. Orders rippled out. Engines coughed to life, panzers revving their Maybach HL-120s in a symphony of reluctant power. You sensed the defeat in the air, the sagging shoulders of the crews, the way Sergeant Werner winces as he climbs aboard, his bandaged arm a badge of the folly. The column formed up, a ragged serpent of steel snaking westward. Panzer IIIs, screening the flanks with their 50mm Kabuke 39s, half-tracks towing the wounded on improvised litters, engineers mining the defile's approaches with telemines to slow pursuit. Von Luck's recon darted ahead, their wire-guided antennas whipping as they scouted for ambushes. The withdrawal was a masterclass in misery. Mud clung to tracks, slowing the heavies to walking pace, while Soviet scouts, snipers in ghillie suits with Mosin Nagant rifles, picked at the edges, a crack here, a scream there. A Sydney Agivzeda 251 took a round through the radiator, steaming to a halt. Its crew pushed it off the track under covering fire from a flanking Panzerfe's coaxial MG-34. Dietrich rode in the lead, binoculars glued to the horizon where dust clouds hinted at Soviet patrols. 10 minutes, that's all it had been. A blink in the campaign's grand sweep, yet it had unraveled threads pulling at the entire Eastern Front. By midday, they reached the Berezina line, a hasty trench network reinforced by sappers from the 78th Infantry Division. Here, the 18th dug in alongside weary Lancers, their 105mm EFH-18 howitzers, zeroed on approach roads. Casualties were evacuated to field hospitals in Opel Blitz trucks, the moans fading into the rumble of incoming reinforcements. Fresh Panzer IV Ausf, Ds from the rear, their long-barreled KWK-37s a small comfort. But the maps in the command bunker told the hard truth. Minsk held, Soviet counterattacks blunting the encirclement. Zhukov's armor now threatening to pinch off Guderian's southern flank toward Smolensk. That evening, under a sky bruised purple by distant flares, Dietrich received the formal reprimand via runner. Demotion to major, effective immediately, with a transfer to staff duties pending inquiry. Zeitzler's note was curt. Your error echoes. The ridge loss delayed Minsk by weeks. Soviet reserves redirected south cost us Kiev's timetable. Learn from it, or the front pays. He crumpled the paper, the weight settling like the river's fog rolling in. Around the foxholes, men shared rations, cold herbs and souper from tins, black bread hard as brick, whispering of the 10-minute curse that had turned victors to victims. Night fell with a chill that seeped into bones, the pop of Soviet probes lighting the wire. A Stuka patrol droned overhead, bombs thudding harmlessly into empty fields, a hollow echo of yesterday's fury. Dietrich stood watch, cigarette glowing like a lone star, reflecting on the human ledger. His division halved, dreams of Moscow deferred, the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility cracked. The Reds, resilient as the birch that bent but didn't break, had turned his hubris into their legend. Barbarossa rolled on, but scarred, those 10 minutes a pivot where certainty shattered into the grind of attrition. In the quiet hours, as stars wheeled over the front, Dietrich wondered if redemption lay in holding this line, or if the abyss he'd glimpsed would swallow them all. The war's machine ground forward, indifferent, but the cost etched in every survivor's eyes ensured the era's legacy endured.